Admiral Sarah Chun stood in the center of the massive Galactic Council chambers, her blue uniform looking plain next to the colorful delegates around her. The chamber was huge, with floating platforms for each species. Light beams connected everything, making the whole place look like a crystal cave filled with stars. She looked at her datapad one more time. The numbers were not good. Earth needed money to keep the museum ships running. These old warships floated in orbit around Earth like sleeping giants. Some were from the 21st century, others from humanity's first wars in space. All of them were old. All of them were expensive to maintain. Honorable delegates, Chine began, her voice carrying across the chamber through translation devices. Earth requests emergency funding to maintain our orbital museum fleet. These ships represent our military history and serve important cultural purposes. A sound like breaking glass filled the air. That was Counselor Vex Thole laughing. The Zephyrian looked like a walking crystal statue, but Chun knew he was one of the smartest beings in the galaxy. His crystal body flashed with colors as he spoke. Admiral Chun, Vex Thole's voice was like wind chimes in a storm. You want us to pay for old junk? Ships with kinetic weapons? Nuclear engines? These things are museum pieces for a reason. Other delegates began making their own sounds of amusement. The collective's representative, a mass of biotech that looked like living metal, pulsed with what Chun had learned was their version of laughter. Human attachment to primitive weapons shows psychological problems. The collective spoke with a voice like computer static. Modern warfare uses energy manipulation, quantum disruption, plasma acceleration. You still keep ships that throw metal balls. Chun felt her jaw tighten. She had expected this reaction. Humans were the youngest species in the Galactic Council. They had joined only 50 years ago, and many still saw them as children playing with dangerous toys. These ships have historical value, Chun said, trying to keep her voice steady. They show how humans developed space warfare. Some of these vessels saw real combat in the Titan Wars and the Belt conflicts. A sound like singing crystals came from the luminal delegate. These beings were made of pure energy, existing in special containment suits. When they laughed, it sounded like music. Combat? The luminal's voice was like hearing light. Admiral, your species fought with fusion bombs and railguns. Our weapons can rewrite matter at the atomic level. Your warships could not scratch modern shields. Chun pulled up a hologram showing the museum fleet. 73 ships of different sizes and ages floated in the display. The oldest was the USS Constitution, a nuclear submarine converted for space in 2156. The newest was the battleship Yamato, built in 2298. All of them looked clumsy compared to the sleek energy-based ships the other species used. Look at this primitive technology. Vex Thole pointed at the hologram with a crystal arm. Chemical rockets. Magnetic acceleration. Fusion drives that could power a small city. Why do humans keep these relics? Because they remind us where we came from, Chun said. She felt her temper rising, but forced it down. These ships carried humans to the stars. They defended our colonies. They earned their place in history. The collective's biotech form shifted and flowed as it spoke. Humans show unhealthy attachment to violence. Other species outgrow primitive warfare. You celebrate it. This fleet wastes resources that could fund education or terraforming projects. Around the chamber, other delegates nodded or made sounds of agreement. Chun saw the familiar pattern. The older species saw humans as violent children who had not learned to put away their toys. The maintenance costs are significant, admitted Counselor Thresh of the Corvan Republic. The Corvans looked like tall gray humans with 4 arms. They were Earth's closest allies in the Council. Perhaps the ships could be scrapped. The materials recycled for useful purposes. Chun's heart sank. Even the Corvans were not supporting her request. These ships serve active purposes, she argued. They house training academies. Military historians study them. Veterans give tours to school children. The museum fleet connects our past to our present. Your past is warfare, said the luminal delegate. Perhaps it is time to embrace a different future. Modern species use defensive technologies. Force fields, energy dampeners, quantum shields. We protect rather than destroy. Vexthil's crystal body flashed bright blue, the Zephyrian sign of amusement. The human museum fleet is like keeping cave paintings of stick figures next to modern art. Interesting for scholars, but hardly worth the expense. Other delegates began talking among themselves. Chun heard the word primitive in a dozen different languages. The translation devices could not hide the tone of condescension. I call for a vote, announced the council president, a massive creature that looked like a living mountain. All in favor of emergency funding for Earth's museum fleet? Only the Corvan delegate raised an arm. Every other species voted against the proposal. Motion denied, the president rumbled. Furthermore, this council finds the museum fleet to be an inefficient use of resources. Earth has 6 months to decommission these vessels or face reduced status in the council. Chun felt the blood drain from her face. Reduced status meant Earth would lose voting rights, trade benefits, and military protection. The museum ships were not just being scrapped. They were being used as weapons against humanity's place in the galaxy. However, Councillor Thresh spoke up. The Corvan Republic formally requests a 6-month delay for proper decommissioning procedures. These ships contain hazardous materials that must be removed safely. The president considered this. Granted. Earth has 6 months to safely dismantle the museum fleet. This session is adjourned. As the delegates began leaving their platforms, Chun stood alone in the center of the chamber. Around her, beings of incredible intelligence and power discussed lunch plans and trade agreements. None of them looked at her as they passed. She walked back to the human delegation area, where her aide waited with more bad news. Admiral, we are getting reports from the Rim territories. Long-range sensors are picking up something unusual. The signals are strange. Chun looked at the data on her aide's tablet. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was moving toward the galaxy. But right now, she had bigger problems. In 6 months, the ships that had carried humanity to the stars would be broken, apart for scrap metal. She thought about the old veterans who gave tours on the museum ships, about the young cadets who trained on the ancient simulators, about the children whose eyes went wide when they saw the massive railguns and torpedo tubes. In 6 months, all of that would be gone, and the galaxy would forget that humans had ever been warriors at all. She just hoped they would not live to regret that decision. 3 weeks later, Admiral Chun was aboard the USS Midway, one of the museum ships scheduled for scrapping. The old aircraft carrier had been converted for space in 2234, and it still smelled like metal and machine oil. She was reviewing decommissioning schedules when her communicator buzzed with an emergency signal. Admiral, you need to see this, came the voice of Dr. Elizabeth Park, the military historian assigned to the museum fleet. The rim sensors are going crazy. Chun made her way to the Midway's bridge. The old ship groaned around her as artificial gravity plates hummed with age. Everything on the museum ships was old, but it still worked. Human engineers had built these machines to last. The bridge was a mix of ancient and modern technology. Original steel panels sat next to holographic displays added decades later. Park stood at the sensor station, her face pale as she watched the readings. What am I looking at? Chun asked, studying the scrolling data. Something big just dropped out of dark space at the galaxy's edge, Park said. I mean really big. The mass readings are off the charts. Chun felt cold despite the warm air on the bridge. Dark space was the empty void between galaxies. Nothing lived out there. Nothing could survive the journey across that infinite darkness. How big? She asked. The lead ship alone masses more than a small moon, and there are hundreds of them, maybe thousands. The sensors can't get an accurate count. Chun activated the communication system. Get me the Galactic Defense Command. Priority Alpha. The main screen flickered to life, showing the familiar crystal form of Admiral Vextel. But the Zephyrian was not laughing now. His crystal body was flashing emergency red. Admiral Chun. Vextel's voice carried fear for the first time Chun had ever heard. We have a situation. Unknown vessels have entered the galaxy. They are not responding to communication attempts. What do we know about them? Chun asked. Very little. They emerged from dark space simultaneously at 17 different points. Perfect coordination across impossible distances. Their technology signatures are unusual. Before Chun could respond, alarms began screaming throughout the Galactic Defense Network. Every ship, every station, every planet-based sensor array was detecting the same thing. The unknown fleet was moving. Fast. Chun watched in horror as the tactical display showed red dots spreading across the galaxy like a disease. The invaders moved in perfect formation, ignoring all attempts at communication. They seemed to know exactly where every major world, every defense station, every fleet base was located. First contact of the Kepler defense line in 40 minutes, reported Park, reading from the network feeds. The Third Fleet is moving to intercept. Chun knew the Third Fleet, modern ships with quantum shielding and plasma cannons. The most advanced warships in the galaxy. If anyone could stop these invaders, it would be them. The wait was terrible. Chun paced the Midway's bridge while reports flooded in from across the galaxy. The invaders had split into dozens of groups, attacking multiple targets at once. Their ships were massive, dark things that seemed to absorb light. Then, the first battle began. Getting combat feeds from Kepler Station, Park announced. Putting it on screen. The main display showed space around the Kepler defense line. 36 galactic defense ships hung in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with energy shields. They looked beautiful and deadly. Then the enemy arrived. The invader ships looked like someone had carved holes in space itself. They were black beyond black, seeming to bend light around them. And they were huge. Even the smallest enemy vessel dwarfed the largest galactic battleship. Third Fleet is opening fire, Park reported. Chun watched streams of pure energy lance out from the defense fleet. Quantum disruptors, plasma beams, and particle cannons lit up space with deadly rainbow colors. The weapons struck the enemy ship's dead center. And did absolutely nothing. Energy shields are absorbing everything, came the panicked voice from Kepler Station. Wait, something's happening. The enemy shields are learning. Chun watched in growing horror as the enemy ships began to glow. The absorbed energy was being processed, analyzed, and redirected. When the invaders fired back, their weapons were perfect copies of galactic defense technology, but somehow better. The first defense ship died in seconds. A plasma beam punched through quantum shields like they were paper. The ship's fusion core breached, creating a brief new star. How is that possible? Chun whispered. Unknown enemy technology, Park read from the incoming reports. Their shields are adaptive. They learn from each attack and develop counters within minutes. Quantum torpedoes are now ineffective. Plasma cannons neutralized. Energy weapons of all types showing zero impact. One by one, the Third Fleet died. Each ship that fell taught the enemy more about galactic weapons technology. By the time the last defense ship exploded, the invaders had adapted to every weapon in the galactic arsenal. All stations, all ships, came an emergency broadcast. This is Galactic Defense Command. Unknown hostiles possess adaptive technology beyond our understanding. All energy-based weapons are ineffective. Repeat, energy weapons are useless. Fall back to secondary positions. Chum sank into the captain's chair. The most advanced fleet in the galaxy had been destroyed in less than an hour. And the enemy was still coming. "Admiral," Park called out, "we're receiving a transmission from Earth Defense Command. Admiral Rodriguez wants to speak with you on a secured channel." Rodriguez had been Chun's mentor at the academy. He was retired now, but still held emergency authority codes. The old man's weathered face appeared on a private screen. "Sarah," Rodriguez said without preamble, "they've never faced anything like us." "Sir?" "These invaders, whatever they are, their technology is too advanced. It only recognizes and adapts to energy signatures within certain parameters. But our museum ships..." He paused, a grim smile crossing his face. "Our museum ships use weapons so primitive, so crude, that advanced systems can't even identify them as threats." Chun felt her heart start beating faster. "You mean..." "I mean break out the old toys, Admiral. The Emergency War Powers Act is now in effect. Every museum ship with a working engine is being activated. It's time to show these aliens what humans used to be good at." Across human space, ancient ships began powering up systems that had not fired in anger for decades. Nuclear reactors came online with deep rumbles. Magnetic coils charged with electricity. Chemical thrusters fired test burns. The USS Midway shuddered around Chun as its fusion reactor reached full power for the first time in 20 years. In the engine room, automated systems began preparing weapons that the galaxy had forgotten existed. Railguns, mass drivers, nuclear torpedoes, kinetic bombardment systems, weapons so simple and brutal that no advanced alien technology had bothered to plan for them. "All museum ships, this is Admiral Chun," she announced on the fleet frequency. "We are no longer museum pieces. As of now, we are the last hope for this galaxy. Prepare for combat operations." Outside the bridge windows, Chun could see other museum ships coming to life. The HMS Dreadnought, a fusion-powered monster from the colonial wars. The USS Constitution with its massive rail cannons. The Yamato-class ships with their kinetic rams. 73 ships that the galaxy had mocked as useless. Relics. 73 ships that were about to remind everyone that sometimes the oldest way of fighting was the best way of fighting. Chum looked at the tactical display showing the enemy advance. The invaders were still adapting, still learning, still convinced they faced the same energy-based technology as everyone else. They had no idea what was coming for them. Captain Maria Santos had been enjoying retirement on Mars when the emergency call came. At 78 years old, she thought her fighting days were over. She had commanded destroyers in the Belt Wars and cruisers during the Titan Rebellion. But she had never expected to captain a ship again, especially not the HMS Dreadnought. The massive battleship hung in Earth orbit like a steel mountain. Built in 2267, it was one of the largest ships in the museum fleet. Its hull was scarred from real combat, and its fusion reactors could power a small city. Most importantly, it carried weapons that modern ships had forgotten existed. Santos walked through the ship's corridors, her old bones creaking almost as much as the metal around her. The dreadnought smelled like machine oil and ozone, the scent of a ship built for war. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows as the crew prepared for impossible combat. The crew itself was a mix that would have been funny under different circumstances. Half were veterans like Santos, pulled out of retirement homes and civilian jobs. The other half were young volunteers, historians and engineers who knew these old ships better than anyone. "Captain," called out Lieutenant Torres, a military historian who had spent 5 years studying the Dreadnought's weapon systems. The main guns are charging normally. Fusion torpedoes are loaded. All kinetic systems show green. Santos nodded. The dreadnought carried weapons that had been outdated for 50 years. Magnetic acceleration cannons that fired solid metal slugs. Fusion torpedoes that were basically flying nuclear bombs. And most primitive of all, kinetic bombardment rods. Tungsten spears designed to punch holes in planets. What's our crew status? Santos asked. 87 personnel. 32 are veterans from the colonial wars. The rest are volunteers from the museums and universities. They know the systems, but they've never fired them in anger. Santos looked out a porthole at the other museum ships preparing around them. The USS Constitution was running engine tests, its ancient nuclear reactors glowing through armored ports. The Yamato was loading its massive railguns with solid shot. Even the oldest ship, a converted submarine called the Turtle, was preparing its chemical rocket launchers. Each ship told a story of human warfare. From the crude but effective weapons of Earth's first space wars to the elegant brutality of the colonial period. They were living history, and now they were the galaxy's last hope. Captain Santos, came a voice over the communication system. This is Admiral Chun aboard the Midway. All ships report ready status. Santos activated her reply system. Dreadnought ready for combat, Admiral. Though I never thought I'd say those words again. Across the fleet, similar reports came in. Captain Williams on the Constitution reported his railguns fully charged. Captain Nakamura on the Yamato confirmed her ramming systems were operational. Even Captain Murphy on the tiny corvette Hornet confirmed his missile tubes were loaded. The strangest part was how the enemy was reacting to them. Or rather, how they were not reacting. Admiral, came Dr. Park's voice from the Midway. Enemy sensors are completely ignoring us. Their adaptive technology is scanning right through our ships like we don't exist. Santos understood why. The invader technology was so advanced that it could only recognize threats within certain parameters. Energy weapons, quantum shields, plasma drives, these registered as dangers. But chemical rockets, magnetic accelerators, and fusion bombs were too primitive to be classified as weapons at all. It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight, muttered Torres. Except the enemy's guns are so advanced they can't see the knife. Santos smiled grimly. Better analogy. It's like the enemy built the perfect mousetrap, but we're not mice. On the bridge displays, she could see the current state of the war. It was not good. The invaders had destroyed 6 more defense fleets using their adaptive technology. Every modern weapon in the galactic arsenal had been analyzed and countered. Plasma cannons, quantum disruptors, even exotic matter projectors, all useless. The enemy ships were spreading through the galaxy like a plague, heading for major population centers. Earth was directly in their path. Museum ships, this is Chun, came the Admiral's voice. We have confirmed enemy approach vectors. 3 separate fleets totaling over 400 ships are converging on the Sol system. Estimated arrival in 6 hours. Santos felt her old warrior instincts kicking in. 6 hours to position 73 ancient ships against 400 alien monsters. In the modern Navy, this would be called suicide. But the modern Navy was dead, floating as debris around a dozen star systems. All ships, begin approach to intercept coordinates, Chun continued. We'll engage the enemy at the asteroid belt. Use the rocks for cover and concealment. Santos turned to her tactical officer, a young woman named Kim, who had written her doctoral thesis on colonial-era space combat. What do you think, Doctor? Can we actually hurt these things? Kim pulled up tactical displays of the enemy ships. Their adaptive shielding is designed for energy weapons, Captain. But our kinetic systems should punch right through. A tungsten rod moving at 1/10 light speed doesn't need to be smart. It just needs to be fast and heavy. And our nuclear weapons? Even better. They're not energy-based, they're matter-based. They create their damage through fusion reactions and radiation. The enemy shields might not even recognize them as weapons until it's too late. Santhus looked around the bridge at her crew. Old veterans with shaky hands but steady nerves. Young academics who knew more about these weapons than the people who built them. All of them volunteers facing an enemy that had conquered 17 galaxies. Torres, she called to her weapons officer. How long since the dreadnought fired its main guns in anger? Torres checked his records. 43 years, Captain. Battle of Ceres Station, during the Independence riots. And how many enemy ships did we destroy that day? A grim smile crossed Torres's face. 7, ma'am. With a crew half the size of what we have now. Santos nodded. These old ships had been built during humanity's most violent period, when every colony was a potential battleground, and every asteroid belt was a place to hide pirates. The weapons were crude but effective. The crews were smaller but more experienced. The tactics were simple but proven. All hands, this is the captain, Santos announced over the ship's communication system. In 1 hour, we will engage an enemy that has never lost a battle. They have technology beyond our understanding and weapons that can adapt to any threat. They think we are harmless because our ships are old and our weapons are primitive. She paused, looking out at the stars where humanity's children lived on 1,000 worlds. They're about to learn that old doesn't mean weak. That primitive doesn't mean useless. And that humans didn't conquer the stars by being polite. Around the dreadnought, the museum fleet began moving toward the asteroid belt. 73 ships carrying the history of human warfare. Chemical rockets that had carried the first colonists. Nuclear engines that had powered the great exploration ships. Weapons that had fought in 12 wars across 3 centuries. The invaders were coming with technology that could rewrite matter and bend space itself. They had adaptive shields, quantum weapons, and the knowledge of 17 conquered galaxies. But they had never faced anything like the museum fleet. Ships too old to register as threats. Weapons too simple to be analyzed. And crews with nothing left to lose. Santa settled into her captain's chair and watched the tactical display. The enemy fleet was massive, unstoppable, and completely confident that in 4 hours, they would learn that sometimes the most dangerous opponent was the one you couldn't see coming. The battle began with silence. Admiral Chun watched from the Midway's bridge as the enemy fleet approached the asteroid belt. 400 ships that looked like holes cut in space itself, their dark hulls absorbing light like cosmic predators. They moved in perfect formation, confident and unstoppable, hidden among the asteroids. 73 human museum ships waited with their primitive weapons charged and ready. Enemy fleet entering optimal firing range, reported Dr. Park from the sensor station. Their scanners are still reading us as space debris. No change in formation or speed. Chun smiled grimly. The invaders' technology was so advanced that it literally could not see them as a threat. To alien sensors designed to detect quantum signatures and energy matrices. The crude fusion reactors and chemical thrusters of the museum fleet registered as natural phenomena. All ships. This is Chun, she announced on the fleet frequency. Weapons free. Show them what humans used to be good at. The HM's dreadnought fired first. Captain Santos watched her main guns unleash hell. Magnetic accelerators hurled tungsten rods, the size of telephone poles, at 1/10 the speed of light. No energy signature. No exotic particles. Just solid metal moving fast enough to punch through a planet. The enemy lead ship never saw it coming. The kinetic rounds struck with the force of nuclear weapons. But the invaders' adaptive shields did not activate. Their technology was scanning for energy weapons, particle beams, plasma charges. It did not recognize chunks of metal as weapons at all. The first alien ship cracked like an egg. Atmosphere vented into space through holes the size of buildings. Secondary explosions rippled along its hull as the tungsten rods continued their path of destruction. "Direct hit," shouted Lieutenant Torres from the weapons station. "Enemy vessel is breaking up." But Santos was already moving on to the next target. The Dreadnought's fusion torpedoes launched in a steady stream. Not energy weapons, but actual fusion bombs flying through space on chemical rockets. The enemy sensors read them as debris or asteroids until they detonated against alien hulls. Across the asteroid belt, the museum fleet opened fire with weapons the galaxy had forgotten. The USS Constitution's railguns spoke with electric thunder. Solid shot accelerated by magnetic fields hammered into enemy ships at incredible velocities. Captain Williams had loaded his guns with everything from tungsten penetrators to old-fashioned steel cannonballs. Against energy shields designed for exotic particles, crude metal was devastatingly effective. The Yamato demonstrated why ramming attacks had never gone out of style. Captain Nakamura drove her massive battleship directly into an enemy cruiser, her fusion drive overloading to maximum thrust. The collision vaporized both ships in a fusion fireball, but took 3 alien vessels with it as debris and radiation spread through their formation. "This is Nakamura," came her final transmission. "Tell them an old Earth saying, sometimes you have to break a few eggs." The enemy fleet was beginning to react, but their responses were chaotic and confused. Their adaptive technology was trying to analyze weapons that did not register as weapons. Chemical rockets were classified as propulsion systems. Tungsten rods were tagged as natural debris. Nuclear explosions were marked as stellar phenomena. "Enemy shields are not adapting," Park reported with amazement. "Their systems can't identify our weapons as hostile technology." Chun grinned as she watched the tactical display. Red dots representing enemy ships were winking out one by one, while the primitive human vessels continued their relentless assault. But the invaders were not helpless. Once they realized they were under attack, they began firing with everything they had. Energy beams that could slice through mountains lashed out at the museum ships. Quantum disruptors tried to unmake human vessels at the atomic level. The old ships began dying. The corvette Hornet vanished in a blast of exotic particles. The destroyer Ranger broke apart under a gravity beam that crushed it like tin foil. The cruiser Independence managed to ram an enemy ship before a plasma lance cut it in half. But for every museum ship that fell, multiple alien vessels died. The primitive human weapons were too crude for the invaders' sophisticated defenses to understand or counter. Captain Santos lined up the Dreadnought for another attack run when enemy fire finally found her ship. A coherent energy beam designed to disrupt quantum fields struck the battleship's hull. It should have unmade the Dreadnought at the molecular level. Instead, it barely scratched the primitive steel armor. "Direct hit from enemy energy weapon," Torres reported. "Minimal damage to hull plating. Their technology is too advanced to effectively target our materials." Santos laughed out loud. The enemy's weapons were designed to fight ships made of exotic matter and quantum-stabilized hulls. Against simple steel and titanium, they were like using a surgeon's laser to chop down trees. "Return fire," she ordered. "All guns. Everything we have." The Dreadnought unleashed its full arsenal. Kinetic bombardment systems fired tungsten spears. Railguns hurled depleted uranium slugs. Fusion torpedoes launched on trails of chemical flame. Nuclear mines drifted toward enemy ships like floating suns. The alien formation was collapsing. Their adaptive technology had been overwhelmed by weapons so primitive that it could not categorize them as threats. Ships designed to survive exotic matter bombs were being destroyed by flying chunks of metal. Admiral Chung coordinated the assault from the midway, using tactics not seen since Earth's ancient sea wars. She launched waves of small attack craft, armed with nothing more sophisticated than chemical explosives and kinetic penetrators. The tiny fighters swarmed through the enemy formation like angry bees, their primitive weapons punching holes in alien hulls. "This is impossible," came a transmission from one of the invader ships. The universal translator struggled with the alien language, but the tone of confusion was clear. "How are these primitives penetrating our defenses?" Chun opened a communication channel to the enemy fleet. "This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the Human Defense Force. You made a mistake when you invaded our galaxy. You assumed that advanced always beats primitive. But sometimes, the simplest weapon is the most effective." The enemy response was a barrage of energy weapons that lit up space like a fireworks display. But the museum ships kept coming, their crude armor shrugging off attacks, designed for a completely different type of warfare. The turning point came when the enemy flagship, a monster the size of a small moon, tried to target the dreadnought with its primary weapon. The beam was powerful enough to sterilize planets. Channeling exotic particles through quantum focusing arrays, it struck the human battleship dead center and dissipated harmlessly. Against primitive steel plating, Santos felt the ship shake but hold together. "Torres, what was that?" "Their main gun, Captain. Exotic particle beam designed to disrupt quantum-stabilized matter. Our hull is too simple to be affected by it." Santos grinned. "Simple has its advantages. Fire everything at that flagship." The dreadnought's final salvo was a thing of beauty. Every kinetic weapon fired at once, sending a cloud of tungsten rods and uranium slugs toward the enemy command ship. The primitive projectiles punched through alien armor like it was paper, each impact releasing tremendous kinetic energy. The flagship began breaking apart, its advanced systems unable to cope with simple, brutal physics. But Santos knew her ship was dying too. Enemy fire had damaged the fusion reactor, and radiation warnings were screaming throughout the ship. The dreadnought had maybe minutes left before core breach. "All hands, abandon ship," she ordered. "This is Captain Santos. It has been an honor serving with you." But Torres remained at his station. "Captain, we still have one fusion torpedo left. And that flagship is still operational." Santos looked at the young man. "Torres, we're evacuating. With respect, ma'am, someone needs to guide that torpedo home. The targeting systems are damaged." Santos understood. A manual attack run. A ramming speed charge at the enemy flagship. A chance to take the alien command ship with them. "Anyone who wants to leave, go now," she announced. "Anyone who wants to finish this fight, stay at your stations." Half the crew evacuated to escape pods. The other half remained, their faces grim but determined. Santos strapped herself into the captain's chair and fired the engines. The dreadnought accelerated toward the enemy flagship, its damaged reactor pushing beyond safe limits. Behind them, the fusion torpedo followed on its targeting beam. "Tell them an old Earth saying." Santos spoke into the communication system as alarms screamed around her. They should have studied their history. The dreadnought struck the alien flagship just as its reactor reached critical mass. The explosion was visible from Earth orbit. A brief new star that marked the end of an enemy command ship and the sacrifice of an old woman who remembered when humans fought with nothing but courage and crude weapons. Across the asteroid belt, the remaining museum ships continued their impossible victory. The invader fleet was in full retreat, their adaptive technology overwhelmed by weapons too primitive to understand. For the first time in their multi-galactic conquest, the Devourers had met an enemy they could not adapt to defeat. An enemy whose greatest strength was being too simple for advanced technology to recognize as dangerous. The museum ships had won, but at a cost that would be remembered forever. 3 days after the battle, the Galactic Council chambers looked very different. The floating platforms that had once held arrogant delegates now carried beings who spoke in hushed, respectful tones. The air itself seemed heavier, weighted with the knowledge that everything had changed. Admiral Sarah Chun stood in the center of the chamber again, but this time she was not alone. The surviving captains of the museum fleet stood with her. Captain Williams of the Constitution, his arm in a medical brace, but his eyes bright with pride. Captain Kim of the destroyer Wolverine, the youngest captain in the fleet at 32. Captain O'Brien of the missile cruiser Patrick Henry, whose ship had taken down 6 enemy vessels before limping home. 23 museum ships had survived the battle. 50 had been destroyed, along with over 800 crew members. Heroes like Captain Santos and Captain Nakamura would be remembered forever, but their ships were gone. Still, those 50 ships had destroyed an enemy fleet that modern technology could not touch. The Galactic Council President, the massive being that looked like a living mountain, spoke first. Admiral Chun, the Council formally apologizes for our previous judgment of your museum fleet. We failed to understand the value of preserving different approaches to warfare. Councillor Vexthel's crystal form flickered with colors Chen had never seen before. Later, she would learn these were the Zephyrian expressions for shame and respect combined. Admiral, Vexthel's voice was quiet, without the arrogance that had marked their previous meeting. We made a fundamental error. We assumed that technological advancement always meant superiority. The invaders made the same mistake. Chun nodded but said nothing. Around the chamber, delegates from dozens of species watched her with new eyes. These were beings who had mocked human attachment to primitive weapons just months ago. Now they understood that sometimes primitive meant effective. Dr. Elizabeth Park, the military historian who had served aboard the Midway, stepped forward with a datapad. Counselors, we have completed our analysis of the enemy retreat. The invader fleet has withdrawn beyond the galactic rim. Our intelligence suggests they are regrouping, but their losses were severe enough to delay any future attacks for years, possibly decades. What made your weapons so effective? Asked the collective representative, the biotech entity that had once dismissed human warfare as barbaric. Our analysis shows that the enemy adaptive technology should have been able to counter any threat. Chun smiled grimly. Their technology was designed to recognize and adapt to energy-based weapon systems. Plasma, particle beams, quantum disruptors. Anything that used exotic particles or manipulated fundamental forces. But our museum ships used kinetic weapons. Solid projectiles accelerated by magnetic fields or chemical propulsion. To their sensors, a tungsten rod fired by a railgun looked like space debris. Captain Williams added, their shields were programmed to stop energy. They had no protocols for stopping a 2-ton chunk of metal moving at 1/10 light speed. The luminal delegate, the being of pure energy, seemed to dim as it processed this information. You defeated galaxy-conquering technology with rocks thrown very hard? Essentially, yes, Chun replied. But it was more than that. The invaders had conquered 17 galaxies using the same strategy: analyze enemy weapons, adapt their defenses, then copy and improve the weapons for counterattack. They had never faced an enemy whose weapons were too primitive for their systems to recognize as weapons. Councillor Thresh of the Corvan Republic, Earth's longtime ally, spoke up. What lessons should we take from this victory? Chun looked around the chamber. That diversity of approach matters. That preserving old knowledge has value. And that sometimes the most advanced solution is the simplest one. But the real changes came in the days and weeks that followed. Within a week, the Galactic Defense Command issued new procurement orders. They wanted railguns, magnetic accelerators, kinetic bombardment systems, chemical rockets, even nuclear torpedoes. Weapons so simple that adaptive technology could not categorize them as threats. Species that had not built kinetic weapons in centuries began dusting off old blueprints. The Zephyrians, masters of crystal technology, started developing crystal-tipped penetrator rounds. The collective began bioengineering, organisms that could survive the journey through space and then explode on impact. But they all came to humans for advice. The shipyards around Earth, which had been scheduled to scrap the museum fleet, received the largest military contract in galactic history. Not to build new ships, but to build old ships. Vessels based on primitive human designs, armed with weapons that advanced aliens had forgotten were possible. Captain Chun found herself promoted to Grand Admiral, in charge of the new Primitive Warfare Research Division. Her first task was to design a training program that would teach alien officers how to fight with kinetic weapons and chemical explosives. The irony was not lost on her. For 50 years, humans had tried to learn from their alien allies. Now the entire galaxy was trying to learn from humans. Dr. Park established the Galactic Military History Institute, dedicated to preserving and studying primitive warfare techniques from across the galaxy. To everyone's surprise, many species had their own equivalent of museum ships, old vessels and forgotten weapons that might prove effective against adaptive technology. The museum fleet itself became a symbol of something greater. The surviving ships were not scrapped, but instead became the core of a new fleet. Young officers from across the galaxy competed for the chance to serve aboard ships like the Constitution or the Wolverine, vessels that had proven the power of simple, direct action. 6 months after the battle, Chun stood on the bridge of a new ship, the USS Santos, named for the captain who had given her life to stop the enemy flagship. It was built using 23rd century human technology, with modern improvements but primitive weapons. The Santos carried railguns that could fire solid shot at relativistic speeds, fusion torpedoes that were basically flying nuclear bombs, kinetic bombardment systems that could drop tungsten rods on targets from orbit, and most importantly, a crew trained to think like their ancestors, to fight with simple tools and direct tactics. Admiral, called Lieutenant Torres, who had survived the Dreadnought's destruction and now served as Chen's weapons officer. We're receiving a priority transmission from the rim sensors. Chun felt a familiar chill. The Invaders? No, ma'am. Different energy signature. Another unknown fleet, but smaller. They're broadcasting on multiple frequencies. Chun activated the communication system. This is Grand Admiral Chun of the Galactic Defense Force. Identify yourself. The response came in heavily accented but understandable Standard Galactic. This is Commander Zix of the Hegemony Advance Fleet. We represent the Spiral Alliance, a coalition of species from the next galaxy. We received reports of a primitive species that defeated the Devourers. We have come to learn from you. Chun smiled. Word was spreading across the void between galaxies. Other species were learning that the unstoppable Devourers had been stopped by a small fleet of museum ships armed with primitive weapons. You're welcome to visit, Chun replied. But fair warning, you might not like what you learn. Our methods are crude, direct, and sometimes brutal. We solve problems by hitting them with large objects moving at high speed. Admiral, came Zix's response. We have been fighting the Devourers for 3 centuries. Crude and brutal sounds perfect. Chun looked out the bridge windows at the stars where human colonies thrived. Once, humanity had been the youngest species in the Galactic Council, struggling to prove they belonged among advanced civilizations. Now they were teachers, showing the galaxy that sometimes old ways were the best ways. The museum ships had done more than win a battle. They had proven that wisdom could come from any source, that strength could take many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful weapons were the ones nobody expected. In her final log entry that day, Chun wrote, "Today marks 6 months since the Battle of the Asteroid Belt. The galaxy has learned many lessons from our victory. The most important may be this: never underestimate an enemy you don't understand. The Devourers made that mistake when they encountered our museum ships. We must be careful not to make the same error with whatever comes next. She paused, looking at the tactical display showing new ship designs from across the galaxy. Railguns next to energy weapons. Chemical rockets alongside quantum drives. Primitive and advanced working together. The universe is vast and full of threats we cannot imagine. But it is also full of solutions we have not yet considered. Our museum ships reminded us that sometimes the oldest answer is the best answer. Sometimes the most advanced warfare is the most primitive warfare. Chung closed the log and returned to her duties. Outside, the stars waited with new challenges and new opportunities. But now the galaxy faced them together, armed with weapons both ancient and modern, prepared to meet any threat with solutions both simple and sophisticated. The museum ships had taught them all a valuable lesson. Never throw away the old ways until you're sure you'll never need them again. And in a universe full of unknowns, you could never be completely sure of anything.